Okay, so I'm Tom Wong, assistant professor in the political science department. I am 3 years into my job. When I first started, it was around 2013. I do immigration, race, and ethnicity. I sort of am in a top 10 political science department. The immigration debate was sort of in the news, and I thought, well, how can I sort of prove my worth to this department? And I thought, okay, well, if Congress is going to vote on a bill on immigration reform, then if I am an immigration researcher, I should have something to say about it. And so what I thought that I would do is sort of model congressional voting behavior, thinking about the issue of immigration specifically, think about the 100 senators in the Senate, the 435 members in the House, and actually forecast the votes on comprehensive immigration reform. And so when I sort of cooked up this idea, some of my sort of senior, faculty members said, "What the hell are you doing? That's a terrible idea, because what if you're wrong?" And I stepped back and I was like, oh man, what if I'm wrong, right? Because I made these forecasts public. But, but lucky for me, a few months before the Senate voted on the bill, I had a forecast and it was out in the world. And then right before the final vote, there was this amendment. And I got really nervous because this amendment was supposed to add literally a dozen, additional votes in the Senate on this particular bill. And so I was going through going through the modeling, going through the simulations, and sort of updating the forecast. And I could only get 2 additional votes. And I was like, oh man, everybody was right. I just ruined my career. Okay, so my initial forecast was 67 votes. After this amendment was introduced, all I found were 69 votes. All the chatter on the Hill was maybe 75, 76, almost 80 votes on this particular bill. And so during the actual vote, I was sitting at a parking lot at McDonald's by myself, just kind of listening to C-SPAN and just hoping that I would be somewhat close to right. And so lucky for me, I still have a job, right? So the actual vote in the Senate was 68 votes. So a few months before I said 67, afterwards it was 69 because of this new amendment, and 68 was the best that I could hope for, and that's what I got. And so lucky for me, the House didn't take up the vote because I forecasted the House too, and I could have been completely wrong and had to go through it all over again. But that's kind of sort of my origin story for the work that I'm doing now, because in terms of political behavior, one aspect of political behavior is how members of Congress, how our electeds are actually sort of thinking about what their job is and sort of whether or not that imagination informs how they vote on different issues. But then another aspect to behavior is sort of how individual citizens behave in our democracy, sort of what sort of leads some people to vote and others to not vote. And so here, what we see is this story that I think we are very familiar with. And I know this, figure is hard to read, but these are voting trends in the United States for presidential elections based on race and ethnicity. And so we see the dark green part of the bars being those who actually vote. The x-axis is time, so these are presidential elections across time. And the different categories are on the left: white, non-Hispanic, then African-American, Hispanic, Latino, and Asian. And so a lot of what we focus on is how for Hispanic Latinos and how for Asians, so few are actually registered to vote. And so a lot of the work in political science, for those who are interested in political behavior, is to try to figure out how we can raise these bars overall so that those who are eligible to vote are actually registered to vote. But there's another perhaps more interesting question, I think, to ask, because the difference between the dark green and the light green are those who are registered to vote versus those who actually vote. And so for Hispanic Latinos in 2012 here, we see that about 60% are registered to vote. So we all think, okay, 55 million Hispanic Latinos in the United States, 40% aren't registered to vote. That's 22 million people to potentially go out to and encourage them to register to vote. But if you take that 22 million number and you start sort of slicing it up in different ways, then only about 9 million can actually register to vote. So then the comparison is this 9 million versus this gap here, which for 2012 was 6 million. And so what's easier, sort of encouraging somebody to register to vote and then getting them actually out to the polls to vote, or just sort of working with those who have already signaled some sort of civic interest and just trying to re-inspire that civic interest so that they go out to vote? So I go for the latter. And same story here for Asians. When we think about this large gap here, well, it actually shrinks to about 4.5 million nationally versus about 2 million, which is the difference between the dark green and the light green gap. So there's a lot of there's a lot of interest across sort of different ways to potentially increase participation in our democracy. But for me, the focus is on those who are already registered and not voting and how we can inspire them to vote. And so here's another reason why I think this is important. If you've ever sort of worked for a political campaign or even managed a political campaign, then there's a pretty traditional process wherein you take a voter file, you cut below a certain propensity. So if somebody has signaled that they voted in the past, then that's the individual that your campaign targets. So that's why we get polls of likely voters before every election. And you kind of wonder, why are we just polling likely voters? Because there are a whole lot of people who can potentially vote. Okay, so when we focus on likely voters, what we're also doing is focusing on predominantly white voters, predominantly educated voters, and predominantly voters with high income. And so what the traditional campaign approach is essentially doing is taking that low propensity strata, which is disproportionately voters of color, those less educated, those with less income, and completely ignoring them when it comes to campaign time. So if you think about why you get mailers, why you get calls, why canvassers knock on your door, because we are all seen as low-hanging fruit, as educated citizens that participate in our democracy. But then you have to ask yourself, well, why do people feel disengaged from politics? Why specifically do voters of color in general feel disengaged from politics? Well, it's because it's this traditional campaign approach that entirely ignores them during election time. They're not getting the door knocks. They're not getting the mailers. They can't go to work and have those water cooler conversations to talk about the negative attack ad from so-and-so candidate because they aren't even exposed to that because campaigns tend to ignore them. And so here, what this work is kind of like my previous work. Well, let's take data. Let's see if we can model behavior, and let's use this modeling and the simulations, based off of the data to see if we can actually learn something about political behavior in terms of the low propensity strata turning out to vote. So here in San Diego County in 2014, we know turnout was miserable across the entire state in 2014. San Diego, it was a little better, a whole lot better than LA County. So I'm imagining a lot of you still vote in San Diego. You didn't sort of change your address yet. But overall, voter turnout was low. And so here we're saying, can we increase voter turnout? And can we do it among that strata that is generally ignored? Low propensity voters of color. So for San Diego, I had the opportunity to run a series of voter mobilization experiments across the primary and the general. So what we did in the primary was actually try to figure out what the determinants were in a randomized experiment of low propensity voters turning out if touched by a nonpartisan civic engagement organization. Because part of what we also do in this space is to figure out what messages resonate with certain low propensity voters, what messengers resonate with those same voters. And we take that learning and we package it into a pitch that is hopefully inspiring, that is not one size fits all. And so here, we take the learning from June and we apply it to November during the general. So in June, we get a sense of these are the sort of determinants of voting if touched among low propensity voters. And so for November, I get about 17,999 people to work with. to say that, okay, here is a group of low propensity voters, and did what we learned in June, like, did that tell us something about what this particular group would or would not do if touched by a nonpartisan civic engagement organization? And so here we're micro-targeting low propensity voters. In other words, taking those factors that we learned about in June and saying there are 4,604 voters within this low propensity strata that we want to focus on. And so this is to tell a traditional campaign that's thinking about the costs of mobilizing low propensity voters and saying, well, of course, not all of these low propensity voters will actually vote if touched. But for these 4,604 individuals, it's worth reaching out to them. Because again, this particular strata, disproportionately Hispanic, Latino, African American, Asian, et cetera. And so in terms of the results, here is the reference group. So for low propensity voters that weren't micro-targeted, turnout was miserable, and it's even worse for the low propensity strata, 23.8%. So if we think about countries that actually require voting, and we don't, and we think that participation in our democracy is important, then 23.8% is our reference number here. But for those who are micro-targeted and subsequently contacted by a civic engagement organization, here this number is 49.7%. So here, overall for San Diego County, turnout in November 2014 was about 44%. So we're getting these low propensity voters to behave like frequent voters. And again, this is essentially saying that we're trying to figure out how, and we've successfully in this experiment showed that those Hispanic Latinos, African Americans, Asians, et cetera, who are generally ignored during campaign season, well, we've showed that don't ignore all of them because some of them will actually turn out if you make the pitch. And so here, a lot of bells and whistles. We want to correct for all sorts of bias, but it's still a robust 14.7% increase in turnout for those micro-targeted low propensity voters. And what's really encouraging is that if we break this out by different racial and ethnic groups, then if we care about participation in our democracy, right, then there are ways to move that along. And we can sort of use what we know in political science, use the newly available data and the increasingly accessible data on voters to try to make these numbers even higher, because this underlying premise is this: our democracy works better wherein politics is responsive to people if people participate. So that can lead to a big mess, right, if everybody's participating. But on the other hand, well, maybe that actually gets us a step closer to a more just, fair, and inclusive democracy that can address those disparities and inequities that we are all trying to alleviate. So, thank you.